Alright, so today I wanted to talk about active participation in the Mass. What does it mean? What's usually thought of, and some of the differences between the way that active participation is handled in the Latin Mass versus the Novus Ordo Mass. So when you go to a Novus Ordo Mass, what you usually think of in terms of active participation might be something like doing the readings, doing the responses, maybe serving as an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion. So essentially having lay people do various functions and just responding to the priest as much as possible. Now, while this is usually encouraged in a Novus Ordo Mass, it isn't necessarily what is meant by active participation. Usually when priests who celebrate the Novus Ordo talk about active participation, they usually mean really the interior of a person, the way that you're focusing, the way that you're trying to understand what's going on at Mass, and trying to more so participate with your, I guess just your inner demeanor more than the words that you might be saying. Now, that said, the responses and doing additional service at the liturgy are usually very encouraged, whereas if you go to the Latin Mass, there's very little lay participation, whether that be in responses, whether that be in doing anything like readings. That's always reserved for the priest or the deacon if you're at a solemn high Mass. The best that the best that you'll get is something like maybe choir, and of course young men are encouraged to altar serve. So why is it that the Novus Ordo Mass encourages all of these responses and all of these additional functions of the laity, whereas the Latin Mass does not? So first and foremost, I will say that it's not some kind of I guess intention to focus on the past or whatever when saying that lay people maybe it isn't necessarily good for lay people to be doing all these different things. And well, we've already said that both the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass encourage the inner demeanor of a person, right? The way that your heart approaches the holy sacrifice of the Mass. So my question is, what does this better? Now, last time we talked about the idea of show, don't tell in the context of the liturgy. So what are we trying to show by active participation? So if you go back to the days before the Second Vatican Council, we'll see that there are 7 not minor orders, but there are 7 steps to the priesthood. So there's not actually just getting ordained as a deacon and then being ordained as a priest. We actually had 7 in total, including the priesthood. Some of these were minor orders, and then subdeacon, deacon, and priest were considered, I believe, major orders. So some of the minor orders were things like lector, porter, right? So these were steps to becoming a priest, right? If you were a lector, that meant that you were serving at the altar well, no, you wouldn't be, the subdeacon would be reading at Mass, but the lector had some responsibility over scripture, right? But furthermore, yeah, the subdeacon and the deacon would be reading the actual epistle and the gospel. So essentially what I'm trying to get at here is that these little functions that people get as laity in the church were once reserved as minor participations in the priesthood, right? So when we think about it, we're actually giving people tasks that should be done by clergy, because this is a sort of participation in the priesthood. Same thing with responses. Responses were usually just done by altar servers. and not so much by the laity. Now, dialogue masses were encouraged by Pius X, I believe. I may be mistaken about that, but I'm pretty sure. Someone can correct me about that if I'm wrong. But it's also, even in a Latin Mass, you have much less back and forth. You know, you really just do the preface dialogue, like Sursum Corda, we lift up our hearts, we lift them up to the Lord, that whole section. I don't think there would be much else that you would really have from the laity unless you're like singing along with the choir, which isn't really the same as doing like responses and stuff. So what might be the advantage of not doing the responses? Well, like I said, you're kind of reminding yourself of what the function of the priest is, right? The priest is the one celebrating the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The laity's participation, like I sort of mentioned in the last video, is more of a passive one. So I wouldn't say exactly the opposite of active participation, because you're still being active by receiving, but it's very much a passive reception, right? The priest is the one doing the active work on behalf of the people. The people are the ones essentially God is receiving the work from the priest, but God is also pouring graces onto the people who then receive those graces. So, when the people participate by speaking, it could be a little bit distracting sometimes. So, we talked about how both masses want to encourage the person's inner demeanor, essentially, and so yeah, the question is which one would do that better? I would argue that it's not as easy to focus in prayer when the expectation is for you to constantly be responding and doing all of these external signs of sign of peace and things like that, which you don't see at the Latin Mass, and having to constantly switch your focus on what you're listening to, right? Sometimes there's a reading, sometimes there's a psalm, sometimes it's like the Eucharistic prayer, and you have to focus on Christ's coming, and it's a lot more difficult to kind of encourage your mind to focus, whereas at the Latin Mass, with that silence, you just kind of trust the priest that he's doing his job, he's doing the prayers he's supposed to be doing, and you can focus in whatever way you want, so you can, if you're not quite able to follow along with everything, you don't have to. You should be focusing on the Mass as best as you can, but you're not necessarily expected to understand everything. In fact, Pius the 12th, I believe, it might have been 12th, it might have been 10th, actually said that, if you don't understand, you can pray the Rosary at Mass. And the way that Taylor Marshall puts it is, is it okay to ask Mary for help for prayers during Mass? Sure. Is it okay to focus on the mysteries of Jesus' life and death and resurrection at Mass? Certainly. So, therefore, why not say the Rosary, right? Now, in the Novus Ordo, it doesn't really make sense because you have all of these participations that you're supposed to be doing, whereas in the Latin Mass, those are not, those aren't there. So you're focusing on things the way that you sort of want to be focusing on them. Now, I know this is kind of a new way of looking at it maybe for some people, so I would encourage you once again to try checking out the Latin Mass if you haven't already. Kind of see for yourself what I'm kind of talking about. It's a little hard to explain, and it might come off as critical, and it is in a way. I am trying to get people to think about what might be better, kind of, is what we're used to doing necessarily the best way of doing it? Can we do better? And perhaps we can. So if you get the chance, I certainly encourage you to check out a Latin Mass and see maybe if that way of participation works better for you, you know? So see you next time when we'll talk about, I'm not sure yet. We'll figure it out. But thanks for watching, and God bless.